I think the coolest thing for me about watching NASCAR over the years is the tough-as-nails drivers that have filled the seats of their equally tough-as-nails machines. 3,400-pound bricks that thunder around over 200 miles per hour, oftentimes upside down. The likes of Dale Earnhardt can come to mind, along with the likes of the Iceman Terry Labonte, alongside Cale Yarborough and his brothers, the Petty family, and hell, the entire Alabama gang too, amongst many others like Ken Schrader, the likes of which had come up from sprint car racing, and just about every modified driver who has ever turned a steering wheel. But for me, Ricky Rudd is where it's at. Not only was he tough as nails, but incredibly versatile too. From motocross to Cup Series stock cars, this is the story of the driver that they couldn't snuff out. This is the story of Ricky Rudd.
But them guys right now have got goosebumps all over. They're not believing this. In his career, Ricky Rudd will take the checkered flag and win the Slick 5300. Earnhardt is second. Wallace is third. Mark Martin is fourth, and Todd Bodine scores a career-high fifth-place finish.
Oh, trouble! Ricky Rudd slamming toward the wall, crashing, rolling over, side over side. Ricky Rudd, Ford automobile out of control, side over side several times. Lands the grass just the top of pit road. The Budmore car destroyed. You're watching live from the Daytona International Speedway, the Busch Clash of '84. The most serious crash in the 6-year history of this event has just taken place.
And alert and smiling. He just said, hand me a Tide hat. Like, I can't get up, but I got to wear my Tide hat. Congratulations, man. What an effort.
Well, I'll tell you, these guys had a heck of a race car underneath them. I mean, I was in trouble from about lap 5. My helmet wasn't working, really hot in the car. And got blisters on my back, on my butt, whatever you think of. And like Bill Engel kept me going. I said, I'm sure I'm going to enjoy. We can get this thing this win. I'll enjoy Monday in the hospital or somewhere recovering. You got a heck of a race car. It was a good deal to win this thing away. watch the footwork of Ricky Rudd. That guy is he's accelerating out the brakes as they go through the exit. Fourth gear.
Ricky was born on September 12, 1956, in Chesapeake Beach, Virginia. Despite being the second youngest in the family, he more than made up for his age with his enthusiasm, pestering his father to go out on the neighborhood cul-de-sac in a go-kart. Quickly, he felt this wasn't fast enough for him, and it was only a matter of time before he would be old enough to pick up the pace. And pick up the pace he did, jumping, often literally in some events, in a motocross spec dirt bike. Whilst a move from go-karts to motocross may seem a bit steep at first, it is at least reasonable and somewhat expected. What is a large leap, however, is going from motocross to stock car racing. But, lest we forget, a certain Scottish rally superstar took a not-so-dissimilar approach to full-bodied race cars, so perhaps it may not be entirely out of the ordinary as it may appear. And it wasn't like he dropped his go-kart efforts entirely. In fact, he had doubled his efforts and mostly did East Coast touring. Tracks like the venerable VIR would be the mainstays for him to help heighten his skills. Skills that he'd later prove especially handy in the Cup Series, and something that would help him stay above the rest, especially with his tenacity. Having put the brakes on the go-kart racing career by the time he was 17, Ricky had heard from one of his older brothers that one of their best friends, Cliff Champion, had a cousin that may be looking for somebody to fill the seat for next year. This cousin was none other than Bill Champion, an independent car owner/driver who had over 280 starts under his belt by this point. The ride in question was a very elegant 70s Ford Torino with a 7-liter V8, just for good measure. Bill was looking to get out of the driver's seat and into the, shall we say, car owner's office chair. Despite the fact that he didn't even have street stock experience, let alone in something like a late model, Cliff had vouched for Ricky's abilities in go-karting and motocross. Understandably, though, Bill wasn't entirely convinced, but felt there was no harm at least trying him out. And try out he did, as the now 18-year-old Ricky Rudd was set for the number 10 Ford at Langley Field Raceway just to get some hot laps and to be able to familiarize himself with startup, feel of the car, and shutdown procedures. Ricky was understandably a bit perturbed about the whole ordeal, given the fact he had never done anything like this before. As far as he was concerned, this was almost as dangerous and about as fast as the work being done just across the street at NASA's Langley Research Facility. After making the ride down to Daytona Beach for the Busch Series race, then called the Late Model Sportsman Series, Ricky would fail to qualify for the event. Chances were slim anyway, however, as over 75 drivers would attempt to make the field, and he personally didn't believe he had the courage or know-how to make the full race distance anyway. Still, this was additional seat time at the Great American Race, and would help dispel some doubts about Ricky's abilities, even if Ricky himself still had some of his own. The biggest hurdle of the day would be the size and weight of the car itself. Yes, the 427 big block wouldn't have much issue getting it up to around 180 miles per hour or so, but steering the over 3,400-pound or more heavy-duty Torino would be no mean feat. You'd be fighting a tight condition that couldn't be solved with additional throttle inputs. Needless to say, this was no simple go-kart anymore. Naturally, next up was Rockingham in North Carolina, this time in a full-fledged Cup car. This time he would qualify to make the field, started the race 26th, and better still, finished just outside the top 10 in 11th place on his debut. Impressive on his own, but given that this was the era of the drivers such as Dick Brooks, Dave Marcus, Richard Petty, Cale Yarborough, David Pearson, amongst others, that's pretty good going. Don't think for a second that came easy, though. Yes, motocross gear wasn't exactly lightweight back then, but 500 miles of racing at Rockingham is exhausting for just about anyone, especially for someone who has never done it before. Track and ambient temperatures were pretty high, even with the new cooling air boxes that were put into place in the 90s and 2000s, but it must have been especially high back in the 1970s. He would go on to qualify for 3 more races that year, with races at Bristol, Atlanta, and North Wilkesboro respectively, with Bristol being his best finish of the year, with the qualifying start at 23rd and finishing 10th, just behind Richard Childress. The young upstart would agree to a 25-race committed schedule for 1977, this time alongside legendary crew chief and car builder Willie Cronkite. He'd fly the banner of Al Rudd Auto Parts, making it a family-sponsored and run car. The car itself originally belonged to equally legendary car owner Robert G., having been purchased to complete the season, albeit part-time. He'd get behind the number 22 Chevy Laguna, starting at Daytona. The season was not without incident, however, and reliability issues would set the team back a little. Rear-end housing failures, engine failures, and transmission faults would take them out of the running on a few occasions. But, when the stars aligned, it was not unusual to see him just outside the top 10. The car itself was good, damn good equipment in fact, but there was still a learning curve for a new driver and team. His best finish, however, would come at Talladega, where he got his first top 5, finishing 4th, just ahead of fellow Virginian Lenny Pond, who would get his lone victory in the Cup Series of the track just a year later. Ricky, meanwhile, would go on to finish the year out 17th in the point standings, earning him his Rookie of the Year title, finishing ahead of Pennsylvanian dirt modified driver Ty Scott. With Ricky helping build the car, with his brother helping on engine building, and a rotating door of volunteer help, it did help keep the doors open on the operation, but not easily. Whilst owning and operating a Cup team may have been cheaper than it is today, it was clear to see that it wasn't going to be sustainable forever. They had to go on and dial back their entire Cup Series effort for 1979, where Ricky would go on to race for another Virginian and short-track coach, Junie Donlavey, in the number 90 Thruxmore car, where he would also receive his best points finish of 9th in the standings. They would only do a handful of starts for 1980, and with Ricky headed off to do races for D.K. Aldrich and later Nelson Mollick's short-lived number 7 Sanyo Chevy. Still, this helped build a rather successful resume that he can take with him to any team just about, and it was about that time the training wheels had got to come off. He wasn't a rookie anymore, and he had learned an awful lot, making his father's investments not in vain. The start of the 1980s brought about both a radically new decade in terms of style off the track, but also on the circuit itself. Gone were the days of Malay-era land yachts with engines that wouldn't look out of place in the engine room of a cargo freighter, and in were the shorter wheelbase, small block, Cup Series and Busch Series cars. These cars were known to be treacherous to drive, with Darrell Waltrip famously despising these cars. Ironically, however, these would be right up Ricky Rudd's alley, as he finally could drive a race car that didn't have the turning circle of an aircraft carrier. He would catch his biggest break in 1981, driving for Bill Gardner's DieGuard racing team in the iconic number 88 Gatorade car. Initially convinced it was a prank call, he nonetheless took the offer seriously and signed on the dotted line, taking the place of Darrell Waltrip, who had a major falling out with the team over foibles such as engine trouble, a lack of general team cohesion, which prevented the duo from achieving championship victories, thus prompting DW to buy his way out of the contract and set sail over to Junior Johnson's number 11 Mountain Dew Buick. For Ricky, the situation was perfect. He didn't have to worry about fiddling with the car every weekend, the team was well staffed, and was at least a championship-capable operation. For once, he had a car template that suited him, a team ready to and willing to support him, and yet another crew chief to back him. This time, Jake Suitcase Elder would sit on the pit box for the first 4 races of the season, before inevitably living up to his nickname and went off elsewhere. But not before helping Ricky finish 3rd in the Great American Race, his best finish to that point, and what an event to achieve that at, beating out the likes of Buddy Baker, Dale Earnhardt, Cale Yarborough, and Johnny Rutherford, finishing just behind the likes of Bobby Allison. Ricky had most certainly impressed. If people weren't interested in him before, they sure were staring at him now. And it's worth pointing out that the road course prowess had really showed itself at the qualifying sessions at Riverside at the start of the season, landing him 3rd place. Had the engine not let go, a top 5 would have been near certain. There were still 25 more races left to go in the season, though, and things only got better for him weekend to weekend, with a 2nd place finish at Bristol, just barely beating out the guy he had replaced in the 88 machine, with his first career pole position start at his home track of Martinsville. He'd receive another pole at the Nashville Fairgrounds, and where he'd finish 3rd and 5th in their respective races. Whilst he would generally finish in the top 5, the engine failures DW had lost his temper over once again appeared, sidelining what would otherwise be a fairly straightforward title contention. It would be the only thing stopping their otherwise incredible consistency all season long. His final highlight of the year would be a pole position at Dover, and despite him not hoisting the trophy at the end of the year, he finished a then career best 6th in points, just ahead of previous year's champ Dale Earnhardt. Speaking of Dale, it would be Rudd that would take the seat in the number 3 Piedmont Monte Carlo for Richard Childress. Richard had, much like Bill Champion and Junie Donlavey, decided that it was a good time as any to get out of the driver's seat and focus their efforts instead on being a car owner. There were concerns, however. Money would be tight. Earnhardt had actually done a couple races back in '81 for Richard, but it was in no small part thanks to the Wrangler jeans sponsorship that helped him stay for a little while. With Earnhardt off to Bud Moore to drive the number 15 Ford Thunderbird, so went Wrangler as well. As such, there would be only enough funding on hand for about 6 races. However, assuming things would go well enough, better deals and funding could come their way. The initial plan was to have modified maniac Greg Sachs in the car. However, due to a nearly life-ending crash at Daytona's testing sessions, it was decided that Ricky Rudd would get to take in the car proper. It was a decent start, though, qualifying 16th, a far cry from pole position. That would be taken by Benny Parsons, who was racing for J.D. Stacy at the time. Ricky would go on to finish 35th. The victory that day would be a controversial one, given that it was a Brickyard victory, his previous employer, and it was done with some, shall we say, clever rear bumper innovation for aerodynamics. A story for another day, perhaps. Anyway, at least Ricky wouldn't have to worry about going back to his day job of being a parts delivery driver. If there was any self-doubts, he wasn't showing it at this point. Still, the season was a rocky one to say the least. Mechanical faults, incidents, and so on would keep him in the top 20 for most of the year, but it wasn't all bad. Later in the year, he snagged a pole at Dover, led 135 laps, and got the pole at his home plate, once again Martinsville, leading 76 laps in the proceedings. He would finish just runner-up behind that day's winner, Darrell Waltrip. This would be backed up with a very similar result, the season-ending race at Riverside, finishing just behind none other than Hollywood Tim Richmond. For Tim, this was a demonstrator of his own road course abilities. And for Ricky, whilst he didn't get to kiss the Winston Cup podium girls, needless to say, he too impressed, keeping Tim honest and keeping the pressure on. Nonetheless, it'd be good enough to round out the year 9th in points, ahead of Morgan Shepherd and 3 spots ahead of Earnhardt. 1983 would go off to a fantastic start, with a pole position at the Daytona 500, a massive achievement for Ricky, even if he didn't end up winning the race or leading more than a lap. This was a huge morale victory all its own. Seemingly not content with getting the pole there, he proceeded to do the same thing at Richmond the following week, and yet again at Rockingham the week after, sweeping 3 pole position starts in a row. That is some damn fine driving. Top 5s would begin to come their way starting at Darlington, and another pole position start came at home plate in Martinsville, with another top 5 finish to boot. Whilst they were still flying high on both the additional Piedmont Airlines sponsorship and great starting spots, typically it seemed a pole position didn't translate to a victory. Still, things would change after a few weeks of less than stellar results with his first ever career victory, and it fittingly would come at a road course. The 26-year-old Virginian can rest a bit easier, knowing that the weight of a Cup victory was off his shoulders, and can instead focus on using this as momentum going forward for the rest of the season. Nonetheless a tall ask, but could this mean that RCR could finally become a championship-winning organization? At the time, it remained to be seen. With Riverside Raceway in the rear view, it was off to Pocono for the following weekend, with him just missing out on pole position to DW. By lap 100, he would miss the entire second half of the race due to engine failure, leading only 8 laps before it went kabang. It would take some time to pick up the pieces left behind, both figuratively and literally, but by late season, he would hoist the trophy once again, this time at his home track of Martinsville, after leading 380 of the 500 laps. With this, and a few decent finishes toward the end of the season, it would be just good enough to match his previous points placement of 9th, just ahead of Tim Richmond, and just behind 8th place finisher Dale Earnhardt. Speaking of Dale, whilst Ricky may have had some bad finishes here and there over the past few seasons, those couldn't compare to the troubles Dale was dealing with. Even with a Rookie of the Year title to his name, and a 1980 Cup Series championship trophy at his cabinet back in Kannapolis, he was nowhere near a contender in the following years after that. His time at Bud Moore's operation simply didn't pan out that well at all. Whilst he did manage to win at least 3 races between 81 to 83, it was a far cry from the 5 races he'd won on his title victory tour, and with far less consistency to keep the momentum going through the year. If it wasn't engine trouble, it was unfortunate accidents and pit road miscues that would keep him out of the fight. Something needed to change, and change fast. Unfortunately for Ricky, this would come as his cost. In the off-season, it was suddenly decided to do a swap. Ricky would go to Bud Moore's operation, and Dale, initially on a short-term basis, would go over to Richard Childress's operation to drive the number 3 car, bringing aboard his part of the Wrangler sponsorship with him. Though fortunately Wrangler would also agree to continue to back the number 15 car as well, leaving 2 of the same cars in the garage area, appearing to be teammates at a glance, but in fact were rival teams. Whilst Dale did in fact vouch for Ricky during the Richard Childress deal, it nonetheless makes it especially painful to be suddenly kicked out by the team that had your back like that. Something Ricky would never get over for many, many years, only managing to hash out their differences in 2001, about 6 months before Earnhardt's death at Daytona. Despite as painful as the misgiving would be emotionally, it would be especially painful during Speed Weeks, as Ricky Rudd finds his Thunderbird trying to join the Air Force Demonstration Squadron, a heavy hit that, fortunately, Ricky didn't have any major recollection of, especially having no idea, until watching footage of it later, how close he was into careening into the infield wall. He would later recall the car getting air, flipping, digging into the ground, and simply being up on 4 wheels before being slowly lifted onto a flatbed. It's pretty remarkable, given the violence of the accident. Fortunately, it wouldn't be enough of a wreck to snuff the Rooster, and he would be medically cleared to continue, with the caveat of needing to wear a flat jacket, and deciding to quite literally duct tape his eyes open. Such incredible tenacity would pay off too, qualifying 14th for the Great American Race, and would finish 7th, just a lap down, but finished ahead of Hendrick's heavy hitter, Jeff Bodine. Seemingly unfazed by the Daytona debacle, he went on to comfortably start his home race from 4th spot. Whilst he didn't lead the most laps that day, in fact, it was nowhere near the most, but he did lead the remaining 36 that actually mattered. Good strategy and tenacity helped him overcome the deficit in the end. It'd be the only win of the season, but it was arguably one of the most important ones of his entire career. Nonetheless, pole positions would come his way at Bristol, North Wilkesboro, and Nashville, respectively. Whilst he was in a position to bout for the title again, starting from the Michigan race onward, reliability unfortunately became a problem. Again. Regardless, he would continue to try and press on, even if the cars didn't want to. The closest he would come to another victory would again be at Martinsville, this time finishing 2nd to Waltrip, an inverse result of his lone win of the season. He would close out the year 7th in points, with Terry Labonte hoisting the first of his 2 Winston Cup championship trophies. 1985 would see the iconic Motorcraft sponsorship and paint scheme for the Ford Thunderbird. This would compound into good initial momentum for the season, as he would get to start first for the first and only time in his career in the Busch Clash, though after 20 laps he would go on to finish 6th. He'd finish 5th at the dual race, and that would give him a very great start for the 500, where he'd be given 9th spot, 500 miles later bringing home a happy 5th behind Buddy Baker. Annoyingly, more engine trouble would sideline him for at least 5 races, but he would at least have more consistent finishes over the year. Runner-up finishes at Bristol and Richmond would have been, and should have been, victories, but it was not to be. Fortunately, though, he wasn't just very good at short tracks. In fact, he was one of the very best in the Cup Series at road courses. Proof positive of this was his previous great runs at places like Riverside, but this time he would nab a top 5 at the first Riverside race of the season, and better still, a win at the season-ending race at Riverside as well, finishing ahead of last year's Cup Series champ. It's almost poetic that the beginning and ending parts of his 1985 campaign were the only happy highlights of the season. They say it's about the journey, not the destination, but I think Rudd would very much disagree, at least that year. He would go on to finish 6th in points. 1986 would see a very intense championship fight between Dale Earnhardt, Darrell Waltrip, and Tim Richmond. Ricky, meanwhile, would just take it in stride and make do. Well, that was the plan anyway, as no less than 5 crashes and 2 catastrophic engine failures would set these plans aside. Sure, he would land a pole position at Dover, but he would start and finish on average of 12th. Ouch. Still, it wasn't all bad. Another home crowd victory at Martinsville can't be that terrible after all. He would finish ahead of the number 26 car of Joe Ruttman, a car that he'd be quite familiar with very soon, as you will see. And he would beat Neil Bonnet to the punch at Dover. Despite this being his worst finishing and average starting position for a full season, he would ride high with a then-career best finish of 5th in points. 1987 would be the final year that he would stick around with Bud Moore. Not due to any kind of particular animosity, but issues that Dale and now Ricky had highlighted over their time with the team was still showing up. Consistency was just not there, and it was one of the major reasons for his misgivings with racing for other teams in general. Not that he would be a pariah about it, but nonetheless sowed the seeds for thinking about going back to his roots, and that of NASCAR's too, of considering to take up being a car owner and driver. He would win 2 races that year, with a W at Atlanta and Dover. Even some very compelling runner-up finishes at tracks like Riverside, it still wouldn't be enough to get him any further than 6th in points, paving a clear and easy road for Earnhardt to take yet another Cup Series title. Enough was enough. Kenny Bernstein of the number 26 Quaker State Buick team came a-knockin', and with Kenny was none other than NASCAR's favorite analyst crew chief, Larry McReynolds. Before he too would look to greener pastures at Robert Yates and number 28 Ford Thunderbird with Davey Allison, Larry was the bedrock upon the 26 team, and indeed the entire team operation, sat upon. Sure, they weren't the biggest high rollers in the Cup garage, but they had tenacity, a stellar crew chief, and personnel that could get things done. And above all, actually try to improve things for the better and listen to feedback. Could this be what Ricky was looking for all along? We'll see what the season entails. Whilst that would turn out to be the case, I guess that memo didn't reach the engine department. So, as long as valves and bottom ends of a crankcase didn't suddenly decide to leave the engine block, it was very likely he'd finish in the top 10 or better. As such, any hopes of running at a championship title outright were no longer the priority. Not to say they wouldn't try for it, of course, but individual race weekend efforts seemed to be what the new focus would be, even with a decent runner-up finish at Richmond behind Neil Bonnet. The next few races wouldn't amount to much of anything until the 7th race of the season, where the first of 2 incidents at the track between himself and his best buddy Dale would end up in the history books. Despite starting in 10th spot, Dale had worked his way up into the lead and started to click off the most laps led. Number 26 Buick was finally coming into his own. That is, until he gets hooked by the Intimidator in the number 3 car, damn near taking the car out completely. Ricky was fuming at the prospect and would begin to run him back down. Deciding that an eye for an eye was fair, the Intimidator himself would get spun by the Rooster he damn near stuffed just a few laps ago. Dale would receive a little comeuppance, but not too much in terms of critical damage to the car, aside from potentially a hurt ego. An injunction would come down from top, literally. And none other than the CEO of NASCAR itself, Bill France Jr., had a mano-a-mano discussion about the events that transpired, trying to play good cop to get an explanation out of him. Ricky confessed that he had felt really bad about the whole ordeal, but felt really, really bad about the fact he didn't completely end Dale's race. The following Monday would see him receive a fax to the tune of a $10,000 fine for, quote, actions detrimental to stock car racing, unquote. It is still largely uncertain if Dale had received a similar fine as well after that weekend's debacle. Additional highlights of the season would include 2 more pole position starts and a win at the rolling green hills of Watkins Glen. Aside from this, it was a fairly dismal season, and he would go on to finish 11th in points. 1989 would signal the end of a decade and bring forth a new body style. Now forever immortalized in the film Days of Thunder, the 3rd generation of stock cars would be largely mechanically similar to the ones from the middle half of the decade, But along with the restrictor plates for superspeedways that have been put on cars since the previous year, new shapes emerged for the Gen 3s. Whilst cars from up to 3 years old were still allowed to compete, so long as they fit technical specifications, teams were encouraged to opt into new, more aerodynamic, yet equally rugged-looking body styles such as the then brand-new Chevy Lumina. The Ford teams largely remained unchanged, given how already aerodynamically stout the Thunderbird bodies were, and even the Oldsmobile and Pontiac bodies would be much more smoothed out to get themselves up to speed. This memo seemingly didn't reach Buick, however, choosing instead to apparently not follow the tenets of drag coefficient, but seemingly choosing to shape it after like a knight's helmet or something. Whilst I don't understand the engineering standpoint behind it, I barely passed math class, I am certainly not going to complain about it from an aesthetic standpoint, because these had to be the coolest looking cars on the circuit that year. One of the recipients of the new shape would be the number 26 team once again, meaning that it hopefully would at least be on the winning of hearts and minds, and could finally get him to intimidate the Intimidator. Whilst the first few races wouldn't bring anything particularly of note aside from a lone top 5, the second Battle of North Wilkesboro would begin on April the 16th. The battleground stage was set, adorned with Winston cigarette packets made larger than life. With the stage set, the war had once again begun.
But Ricky Rudd was ready for it. Yeah, he was. He is right with him. Ricky Rudd is a quicker state Buick. We ride with him. Spin in turn 1. Bobby Hillin against the wall again. We'll see if the yellow comes out. Yeah, I don't believe he's going to get off of that wall. Let's see. No, there we go. He did get off the wall. He did get off the wall. No yellow. 2 laps to go. White flag will come out next time around. Here comes Ricky Rudd moving to the inside of Dale Earnhardt. He's not going to be able to pass him at the moment. Let's see what happens on the final lap of the race. Here comes the field down for the white flag. 1 more to go. Rudd is inside of Dale Earnhardt as they go into turn number 1, and both of them spin. And Jeff Bodine takes the lead. Earnhardt spins along with Ricky Rudd. Here comes Jeff Bodine, who will come down and win the Holly Farms 400. Bodine wins.
An otherwise simple racing incident nearly turned into a full-blown riot that day, with fans of both drivers mixing it up amongst themselves and looking for the heads of their respective opposite. Allegedly, the situation began to get so bad that Ricky and even the otherwise fearless Intimidator chose to duck in the backs of vans with bedsheets or towels over them to keep away from prying eyes. Aside from a few top 5s and another win on a road course, this time at Sonoma, it would be a mostly average season. He improved to an 8th in points. 1990 brought about the beginning of yet a new decade and yet another team change. After amicably leaving the number 26 team, he would head to the biggest deal since Bud Moore, Rick Hendrick's number 5 team, this time ditching the Buick for a yellow and white Levi Garrett Chevy Lumina, filling the now vacant seat left behind by Jeff Bodine, who had put Hendrick on the map in the first place. Jeff would go off to Junior Johnson's Budweiser T-Bird, which would go on to be a formidable force, resulting in 3 wins on the season. Ricky, though, felt confident he could comfortably fill the shoes needed to match Jeff's previous runs and agreed to drive for Rick until 93. With guidance and chiefing from Waddell Wilson, it was time to finally prove it. Consistency proved immediate, with no major faults aside from 3 isolated incidents. Even the 2 crashes that he got collected in weren't enough to derail his top 5 finishing performances, along with top 3s and 2 pole positions, placing him comfortably in 7th at the end of the season standings, finishing ahead of future Winston Cup champ Alan Kulwicki. Having adjusted well to the team, it was time to really go for it. It was Ricky's chance at grabbing a championship of his own. No longer did he just have to hope to get a title. It was finally within realistic reach. During speed weeks, he'd finish 5th in the dual race and go on to start 9th for the 500. Never skipping a beat, he would remain in contention even if it didn't result in him leading any laps that day. He'd finish 9th, a lap down, just ahead of Alan Kulwicki. The win itself would go to swervin' Ernie Irvan, continuing the Daytona domination by the Morgan McClure team. The next 3 races would see him finishing strong, his quote-unquote worst finish being 6th at Atlanta. Nonetheless, these were strong and very impressive finishes, and kept him 2nd in the standings at this point in the season. The 5th race of the season would take the Cup Series circus to the daringly difficult Darlington, whereupon the ringleader would take himself all the way to the checkered flag, with the Victory Lane trophy and celebration waiting for him, and with that would move right to the top of the standings, where he would comfortably remain for the next 3 races. It quickly became apparent that this wasn't going to be so easy. After all, it was a familiar face that was out to snag it from him. Dale Earnhardt had hoisted it at the end of 1990 over a controversial points deduction decision, dropping Mark Martin into a snowball's chance in hell of clinching it over a supposed intake modification infraction. Now, Dale was looking to grab yet another title. After all, he already had 4, and now there's his chance to get a 5th. Not that Ricky would take this lying down, of course. The Bantam Rooster was hell-bent to bring home the big one. He would hold steadfast until Talladega, where he'd be knocked off the top spot. Fortunately, he would only stay bridesmaid for the next few races, where consistency would keep him in contention. He wouldn't be out of the running just yet. Still, there was lots of hope that he could reclaim the points lead, and the first of these opportunities would come at Sonoma. A very competitive qualifying lap would help him secure the pole position, giving him a much-needed buffer. Fancy footwork would result in him leading 11 laps in the race, helping him in the title contention as well. And fortunately, after 90 laps of fighting for the win, it would just slip out of his hands, finishing 2nd to Davey Allison. And, to be very frank, due to a very stupid decision on NASCAR's part. Calling it controversial would be an understatement, too. It's understandable that a final lap bump and run is not going to please everybody, but whatever happened to boys have at it, I don't know. But nonetheless, the decision came from the tower that he'd be black flagged, and therefore would only get the best option of getting 2nd to Davey. A wonderful day for the number 28 team, but the lads in the number 5, not so much. His second break of the season would come at Watkins Glen. He would have a lot of work to do, though, as he would be starting very deep in the field in 22nd. The next 90 laps of competition wouldn't be easy to say the least, with, fittingly enough, I suppose, another 11 laps led, but it still wasn't enough to close the win. Bitterly enough, finishing 2nd once again. He had overcome adversity in the battle, but it was continuing to stay behind in the overall war. As such, discussions between him, Rick Hendrick, and White L. Wilson would intensify in the proverbial war rooms back at HQ in Concord, North Carolina. It would appear that suggestions from Ricky's side of the table were either largely ignored or simply not applied, as the situation remained largely unchanged. As such, Ricky would have to settle for 2nd in the standings by season's end, finishing runner-up to Dale Earnhardt. This was the closest he would ever come to grabbing the title in his entire career, 285 points short of hosting the championship trophy. Back at Hendrick HQ, it was time for more refitting. 1992 would bring about yet another major revision, the emergence of the now 4th generation of NASCAR stock cars, revised templates to be more simplified, and no longer would they be based upon homologated road cars directly. Instead, effectively being from the ground up tube frames with grafted on logos and shapes from the road cars they drew inspiration from. But this was already something that was developing with the latter half of the previous generation of cars, but was now being officially cemented in the rulebook. 1992 would see the most intense Cup Series title fight in NASCAR history, but it was far too early to see that yet, let alone Ricky's place in said title fight. A newer Chevy Lumina body would be backed by the equally new face on the pit box, with Gary Dehart taking the seat in the War Wagon. Daytona would be a wash, barely making it just under 100 laps with outright engine catastrophe, and with Rockingham being a largely pointless venture too. A pole position start at Sonoma would start to improve moods, thanks to leading a few laps and receiving a very respectable finish of 4th, and in turn translated to additional top 5 finishes going forward. Aside from Pocono and Michigan's isolated incidents, the team would never finish worse than 13th. Very nice. Eventually landing a lone season victory at Dover later that year. A couple more strong finishes on the year were commendable, but not enough for the wins. He'd finished 7th in points, with Alan Kulwicki taking the title at season's end, finishing 10 points ahead of Bill Elliott in a 3-way slugfest for the title. While 1992 wasn't really a bad season all in for the number 5 team, same could not be said for 93, where in fact it'd be closer to dreadful. Yes, a win at the Michigan race ensured that it wouldn't be completely winless, but more often than not he would find himself in the lower half of the top 20. And to make it clear, I'm not saying he was doing a terrible job that season, and especially it would be unfair to discount some of the very strong runs he had at places like Sonoma, for instance, where even though he qualified just outside pole, he was staying in the fight till the very end, finishing 3rd. The win, somewhat ironically, going to Jeff Bodine, though, who was racing for Bud Moore at the time. Sprinkle in 9 top 5s on the season, and it becomes plain to see that his struggles weren't from a lack of trying. Still, he would finish the season no better than 10th in points, his 2nd worst finish in the career thus far. 1994 would be his biggest shakeup yet by far, parting ways with Hendrick and being replaced by Texas's Terry Labonte, this time with the Kellogg's chicken on the hood instead of the Levi Garrett yellow cutout thing. Ricky would take the Tide sponsorship with him too, but not to an existing team. As mentioned briefly earlier, Ricky was not happy with how little decision-making ability was given to him. As such, he felt the best solution was to start his very own Cup team. Whilst at a glance that may seem like an overreaction, it is important to realize that he wasn't alone in returning to the roots of NASCAR. In fact, even drivers like Jeff Bodine had also seen fit to start their own team as an owner/driver, in his case operating out of Alan Kulwicki's old shop after his very unfortunate passing in April in 1993, hence the throwback to the Hooters Ford that Alan used. 1988 Cup champ, awesome Bill from Dawsonville, Bill Elliott, would too opt into being a car owner/driver too, albeit not until 1995 with McDonald's backing. Hell, Darrell Waltrip too was keen on what Allen was managing to pull off as an independent, and got in on being an owner-driver as early as 1991. Of course, drivers like Dave Marcus and Jimmy Means had been at this sort of thing for much, much longer, but not with the same level of success. Just in case people wanted to preempt that ahead of time. I know. And many other, besides just those two. Ricky, meanwhile, would open up Rudd Performance Motorsports in where else but Mooresville, North Carolina during the off-season, choosing the number 10, and opting for a Ford body with Ford backing. Bill Engel, previously the crew chief for Michael Waltrip on the number 30 car, would sit atop the pit box. The new car meant that any kind of quote-unquote innovations for plate racing wouldn't be discovered for some time, meaning that for the Daytona 500, he'd roll off 20th, but would stay very strong in the race, thanks to the car's tendency to be better on longer runs. He'd finish a very respectable 8th, just ahead of Bill Elliott, who was still driving for Junior Johnson at the time. Now, as far as team debuts go, you could hardly do much better, showing immense promise going forward. Whilst there was clearly work to be done on the road course cars being done at the shop, with Sonoma showcasing weaknesses to some degree in that regard, the first top 5 of the season with a 4th place at Michigan showed the momentum from Daytona was paying dividends. In July, the team would get their first win as an organization, a true watershed moment. Qualifying 3rd helped achieve this, but raw pace allowed Ricky to lead 55 of 300 laps, finishing just ahead of Dale Earnhardt. The rolling green hills of Watkins Glen showed the additional R&D back at the shop paid off, with a 7th place start and a 5th place finish. A 4th place finish at Darlington helped them get up to 4th in points, though they would be knocked down a peg to 5th after a 25th place finish at Martinsville later that year. Without time left to recover, that's where he'd finish at season's end. But, whilst he didn't hoist the Cup at year's end, he de facto became the most successful owner-driver that year. Hell, even managed to beat out established Cup Series teams like the Wood Brothers, and on that metric alone is something worthy of a cigar award, I'd think. As strong a performance it was overall that season, the same could not be said the following year, as any momentum couldn't be carried forward, whether or not it was slower R&D times that reset last year's momentum, or perhaps just building things in the wrong direction. The jury's out on that one, but nonetheless, top 5s weren't entirely out of the question completely, with a 5th place finish at Bristol and a pole position start and managing to lead 4 laps on the way to a strong 4th place finish at Sonoma. nabbing a total of 10 top 5s, and would make it the most since 1987 for Ricky. But he would still sit very lowly in the standings. At the second-to-last race of the season, at Phoenix, he would finally be able to go out to finish the season with a win at the very least, beating out Derek Cope, the driver who had also made the number 10 famous, with his 2 wins in 1990, along with the win at Dover, chief among which was his victory at the Daytona 500. As for Ricky, he'd close out the season 9th in points, placing him second best amongst the owner drivers that year. 1996 would see Bill Engel head to DEI's number 14 car to help Jeff Green find his footing in the Cup Series, and indeed lay the groundwork for DEI as a whole. And thus a new fella comes into the fold, Richard Broom, who himself had just left Kenny Bernstein's operation. Richard was also where the nickname Rooster had come from. He had christened Ricky with this moniker due to his temperament being akin to that of a bantam rooster. Apparently, despite his otherwise stoic and very focused demeanor, it wouldn't take him very much to speed up or go for an attack run, so long as these certain words were said, or provoked him in a certain way, if you get me. Especially on qualifying timesheets, or indeed on occasion, perhaps in the race as well. The all-new driver and crew chief combo immediately went very, very well indeed, with a 4th place finish at Rockingham, scooting the Rooster to nearly the top of the coupe in 3rd place in the standings, a position he'd hold on to very firmly until North Wilkesboro. Call it fate or happenstance, but he would finish runner-up twice at both Pocono races, finishing second to Jeff Gordon and Rusty Wallace respectively. Making their way over to the Hoosier State, he would roll off the grid 35th at Indianapolis, where he would finish then 6th at the second running of the Brickyard 400, a track he would soon become very familiar with as well. The third-to-last race of the season, at the second Rockingham race, would see him start outside pole, and then bring it home in 1st place, despite a very dominant performance from the 88 UPS car of Dale Jarrett. As such, the team's efforts paid off with a 6th place points finish, the best of any independent that season, and finishing ahead of 1989 Cup Series champ Rusty Wallace. 1997 began with yet another crew chief change, this time with Jim Long taking the pit box hot seat. This could perhaps be one of the more paradoxical decisions, and indeed years, as you will soon see. No doubt a lot of notes were taken on the off-season, calculating and understanding what went right and what went wrong. But, on the whole, it was the worst season in regards to starting and finishing positions up to that point. But, never mind all that. That's just doom and gloom stuff, and it's easy to highlight stuff in statistics and ignore some of the major highlights. I mean, you can look at Dale's and go, oh, his was a terrible season all in. But he still won the 500 after many, many, many years of trying. Ricky's was kind of a similar situation. Let me explain. Because not only did he manage to continue his winning streak in a pretty tide ride at Dover, I mean, just look at that Tide Mountain Spring paint job, but the 4th running of the Brickyard, Ricky Rudd would etch his name permanently into the history books at the granddaddy of them all, the home of the oldest open-wheel racing series in the world. He didn't get the pole at position that day, he didn't even lead the most laps that day, but he did lead the lap that mattered most. And thus, on August 2nd, Ricky Rudd finally won at the Brickyard, the highest achievement in his Cup Series career, and the first and last victory for an independent at the Brickyard in the Cup Series as well. He finished that year 17th in points, behind Bobby Hamilton, but come on, that is cigar-worthy stuff right there. That's pretty freaking cool. What might not be as cool, however, is the beginnings of the career slump, 1998. And where even finishing in the top 10 would prove incredibly infrequent. Daytona saw him finish second to last, and Rockingham would see him indeed finish dead last. By the summertime, a new crew chief change was in order once again, this time with an old friend coming back, none other than Bill Engel. And indeed, while this was very late in the season, it did see a turnaround as far as starting performances went. Front row starts weren't as unusual as they were at the start of the season, and ensured that the Tide ride wasn't there just to look pretty. It was here to stay and fight it out, as people would soon find out. At Martinsville, aka home plate, this was no exception. An outside pole at one of the hottest races of the season still landed him victory 500 laps later, even leading 198 laps, the second highest that day behind Sterling Marlin. And yeah, he did close out the year 22nd in points, even further down the tally than before, But this victory really cemented what Ricky Rudd was all about. If you wanted to show who the Rooster really was in a nutshell, this victory said it all. He had a backup plan in terms of a substitute driver to bail him out if it really was a crisis. And even though they were ready and willing, he still turned it down. That is tenacity. I don't care how you want to put that. So, I guess we're up to a tally for 3 cigar awards. Christ, this is going to be expensive by the end of this. 1999 would be the final year of the Rudd Performance Team, and it wouldn't be too hard to see why, just on a statistical basis alone. Remember, this was all coming out of his pocket. This wasn't 1975 anymore, after all. Things were getting far and away more expensive to buy and maintain, even with Tide providing sizable enough paychecks. Engine problems became more commonplace, as well as chassis issues. Additional crew chief changes over the season, as well as additional personnel swaps and additions, simply could not turn the tide. Even with the expertise of none other than Michael Fatback McSwain, yet another legend in the sport, some guy maybe I'll get around to in the near future, no doubt, wasn't enough to stop the financial bleeding and the continued tumble down the point standings. Third place finishes at a very fiery Bristol, just behind Jimmy Spencer, and just managed to avoid Terry Labonte's spin and not win, and Talladega ensured that they weren't dead last in points either, but it was only good enough for 31st in points. The worst points finish of any full-time season of his entire career. With the new millennium on the horizon and Rudd Performance in the rear view, it was time to look elsewhere. This time, it was for a very high-performance outfit indeed. Robert Yates Racing, a name synonymous with horsepower and outright success. He'd take the seat of the number 28 Texaco Haviland Ford Taurus, and even brought along with him Fatback, too. He'd be Dale Jarrett's teammate for the year. For Ricky, it was a no-brainer. Plus, he wouldn't be the one fronting the bills anymore, allowing him to focus on driving, and leaving McSwain assured that he wouldn't be out of a job. Whilst he would crash out of the Busch Clash, he would go on to dominate the dual race, getting the pole and taking the win in the 125-miler. Although he wouldn't finish much better in the main event, the Daytona 500 of course, finishing 12th. The winner being his teammate. Both cars would go to finish close to each other in 5th and 6th spots, for Dale and Ricky respectively, at Rockingham the following weekend. Whilst it was a winless season for Ricky, 2 Bud Pole Awards is nothing to sniff at, one of which came at Indianapolis. The historical win that day would go to Bobby Labonte, who would go on to take the year's championship as well. Ricky, meanwhile, would close out the year 5th in the points fight. 2001 was another big shakeup. Before the season even began, headlines abound about the return of Dodge in the sport, now joining the 4th generation of stock cars, as other manufacturers already had for some time. Among them, naturally, would be Petty Enterprises, fielding Dodge Intrepids for John Andretti and Kyle Petty. Dale was showing pace, but it was, as he saw it anyway, the ending of his career, so there wasn't much of a need to play the intimidator in the field anymore. Thus, he was planning to retire by the end of 2002. Unfortunately, as a lot of us know, this would never happen. Whilst Ricky and Dale were finally able to crush any misgivings that were left between them, Dale would unfortunately not live to see his retirement, as at the final corner of the final lap of that year's Daytona 500, he would pass of a Basler's skull fracture. This sort of cruel irony wasn't lost on Ricky. Imagine holding nearly 20 years of animosity, finally becoming best friends with that person, only to lose them in a tragic accident. No doubt putting his own life in perspective. I mean, after all, he was 44 years old by this point. He'd been racing in the sport for nearly 26 years, and whilst the idea of a championship victory or a Daytona 500 victory seemed nice, it was high time to put more value into his own life, rather than just wearing himself down chasing things. Retirement wouldn't come just yet, but it was certainly becoming visible on the proverbial windshield. And make no mistake, he didn't press, especially in that year alone, dominating the fall Pocono race by starting first and finishing first, and winning again at Richmond, but it was simply becoming hollow, more so each weekend. Even finishing 4th in points by year's end wouldn't perk things up a whole lot. 2002 began with a crash on lap 148. Yeah, really. That'll put the rest of the season in perspective for you, no doubt. And sure, over the next 36 race schedule, he managed no less than 8 top 5s, but it was becoming apparent that perhaps his heart wasn't in it anymore. That, and well, the Yates engine department wasn't what it quite was before either. That or the number 28 car was being shortchanged for the number 88 instead. That I will leave up to you for debate. Regardless, a 10th place points finish is all he could muster, and things wouldn't go much better. Really. Even with a jump to the Wood Brothers 21 car wouldn't really change anything for the better. Even with the clever Pat Trison on the pit box, it seemed destined that Ricky simply couldn't do much with this car either. With an average start at 27th, it's hard to argue against that. It was the worst in his entire career, surpassing that of even his starting averages in his late teens and his early 20s, and those were back when he was just doing part-time. In the years he toughed it out with the Wood Brothers, he managed no better than his 2002 attempt, otherwise he'd be sitting in the upper to middle half of the top 20. Around the same time, discussions and rumors of retirement abounded, and indeed he would flee the coupe for the 2006 season, until it was announced that he would have one final hurrah for 2007, again with Robert Yates, this time in Dale Jarrett's old ride, the number 88. Despite it being effectively a retirement tour, it was nonetheless impressive to see him race his guts out in qualifying, and trying to hang tough with the new generation of young guns, with Yates' horsepower proving positive at plate tracks especially. Despite it all, though, he managed a lone top 10 with a 7th place finish at the first Charlotte race of the season, and after that, it was mostly hanging near the middle or back of the pack. But that was that. After 33 hard years of hard racing, at age 50, Ricky Rudd would retire from Cup Series competition and indeed racing altogether, with 23 career wins to his name, and of course, his wonderful trophy from the Brickyard. And that does seem incredibly unfortunate from just glancing at the statistics, but of course, racing is more than just numbers on a sheet of paper. It may seem I am taking a more pragmatic and perhaps frankly cold approach to it all, but I myself, of course, recognize, as much as you should as well, the effort and tenacity required to even commit to a part-time schedule, let alone full-time in the Cup Series. Difficult enough when you're driving for someone else, but if you're taking it under your own effort and dime, Christ, just ask Robbie Gordon about the difficulty of that. Hell, even Tony Stewart couldn't do it alone, relying on a partnership to achieve success, and indeed it resulted a championship in his case. And with that, I'm afraid it's time to end. There really isn't much else to go on from here. Ricky Rudd, however, would happily retire and come full circle back to bikes, this time without engines in them, and mountain biking would become a favorite hobby of his, just casually pottering around to enjoy himself, occasionally putting his pilot's license to good use as well. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in a more better turnaround time, as opposed to the usual wait times you guys have been thankfully quite patient with. If you're a new viewer, leave a like and have your say. Perhaps you've discovered something I might have missed, or, just want to make a suggestion for a future video, or just have your say generally. In either case, this has been Clumsy Cardboard. I'd like to thank you once again for watching, and hopefully it was all worth the wait. Hold on, I can't help but think I'm forgetting something. No? Did I mention the Brickyard? Yeah, I think I did, yeah. Did I reach the Busch victory? I might have forgotten that. I mean, that was a pretty good showcase of speed. But there's something, it's eating at me. What the hell was it? I can't goddamn remember. Where the hell did I put... Ah, here we go. Yeah, okay, pardon me. Yes, I'm back. One more thing. Remember how I said that tenacity was something that's kind of required to even compete in motorsport? Well, Ricky had that in spades. Bucket loads, truckloads even. I'm sure that's fairly obvious to you by the time you finished all this. But it's to the point where he could go to toe-to-toe and indeed succeed with folks from overseas. Now, what the hell am I talking about? Well, nothing too special. Just nothing major at all. Just the International Race of Champions. You may know it as IROC. Not the car. It's what it's named after. But okay, let me just explain. Now, who were some of these international hot shoes that he went up against, you may ask? Well, see if some of these names strike your fancy, alright? Jeff Brabham, okay, who mustered no less than 4 IMSA car racing titles driving for Nissan, has even managed a Can-Am championship, arguably the most difficult and insane spec of cars, even under the revised quote-unquote toned-down competition race cars. Twice a runner-up in V8 supercars, and a winner of the grueling Le Mans 24-hour endurance event and 1,000 kilometers of Bathurst, taking part in an absolute car and human spirit breaker that is Mount Panorama. Oh, and those are just some of his accolades, not that those aren't anything particularly too amazing to you, I'm sure. If for some reason that doesn't quite impress you, here's Hurley Haywood, who amassed no less than 3 class wins at Le Mans, a bevy of Trans Am and Camel GT victories to boot, with his steady driving style making him formidable in just about anything and everything he'd ever get to drive. Here's another more familiar one, this time not from overseas, but a bit more local, Al Unser Jr. Okay, he may go by the nickname Little Al, but his accolades, too, are hardly small, alright? 2-time Indy 500 winner, 2-time Kart Series champ, a Can-Am champ, twice a Daytona 24-hour winner, and even conquered the incredibly difficult and very scary Pikes Peak hill climb. Now, for another foreigner, Arie Luyendyk, the Flying Dutchman. He too, twice Indy 500 winner amongst his 12 hours of Sebring and 24 hours race endurance wins, along with being a speed record holder at Indy. Also in the group are somebody a bit more local. Let's try Rusty Wallace, the one and only Dale Earnhardt, Davey Allison, just to name a few more. Now, who among them took the title at the end of the 1992 IROC season? Well, I can't fault you for guessing any of the above, but unfortunately you would be very incorrect. Ricky Rudd would beat them all and claim the title, making him forever and always an IROC Series champion. And with that, and thus rightfully so, more than just a NASCAR Hall of Famer. Not that that's not impressive in its own right, of course. And with that, it's actually time to end, and once again I'd like to thank you so much for watching and being patient for me while I take forever making these videos. I'm gonna be a little bit more consistent about these going forward. But this has been Clumsy Cardboard. See you again soon.
Inside. He's front of. Caution's out. He's front of.
Kenny Wallace squeezing through. So Harvick on pit road with his damaged car. We talked about he and Ricky Rudd tangling racing for the win here. This race 2001. Harvick gets a hold of Rudd. Watch that save. That was one of the best saves I've ever seen. So Rudd gets it gathered up. A few laps later, gets back to Harvick. And it was payback time.
You know, and those good wrench guys, they were there to protect Kevin from himself.
Yeah.
I mean, they were not, that's the only reason they were there.
They weren't there after Ricky Rudd.
No,
they were there to,
yeah, exactly.
These guys are going, hey, get off our car, man.
Very frustrating night, Kevin. I tell you what, Gene Goodwin's car was good tonight. Ricky Rudd took a cheap shot at him. If he's gonna, take a cheap shot, he's gonna get one back. I promise you that.
And it's off to the big red truck.
There's Pat Bryson, the crew chief for Rudd. Marty?
And Ricky being pinned to the car right now by Pat Price and his crew chief. Ricky, what was the contact with Kevin about?
I don't know. Kevin had trouble on the restart. He couldn't get going or something. Anyway, went down turn 1. I guess he just put on the brakes a little harder than he had been, and I got in the back of him. I mean, my fault, but it wasn't on purpose. It was accident. This stuff here is just absolutely ridiculous that NASCAR will put up with this. This is our car that's going next week for the race. Look at the hood. Look at the damage. I mean, that's totally ridiculous after the race stuff like that.
What did he say to you when he climbed out of the car?
I couldn't hear him. He's, got that little yap mouth. I couldn't tell what he was saying.
Fireworks in Richmond.